We live in a society that's obsessed with psychotherapy as the road to inner happiness. The father of all such therapies is Sigmund Freud, the creator of psychoanalysis. Phallic symbols, Freudian slips, the unconscious, all have become part of our everyday language. If you look up neurosis in an encyclopedia, you're told as a fact that it results from an unresolved Oedipus complex, that little boys want to have sex with their mothers and want to kill their fathers.
The Bible said you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. And that certainly is related to the work of analysis, because it's the inner truths about oneself, about who we really are, what we really think and feel, what our attitudes and aims and goals are.
I prefer to say that psychoanalysis is the study of the role in human life of penises and anuses and semen and nipples.
We're on Central Park West, which is where I used to live, and this might be called Psychoanalysts' Row. Behind the facades of these buildings live any number of analysts in daily practice, consulted by any numbers of patients. Over there is the New York Psychoanalytic Institute. This is the inner sanctum of psychoanalysis in the USA. It's rather like a temple. Analysts meet here regularly and attend lectures. They speak a private language with words like id, ego, superego, anal eroticism. Since Freud's death in 1939, the members of this institute have continued to preach the Freudian doctrine. They have been analyzing and interpreting and actually shaping the thought of America's cultural elite for years and years. It's hard to imagine just how big an impact this little building has had on America this century.
Contributing to psychosomatic medicine are the much debated theories of psychoanalysis.
Distressing experiences in childhood may set up patterns which in later life will produce mental conflicts. Let us see how a neurosis develops. Here is a baby, happy in its mother's love. It feels secure even when with strangers, as you see. Now, note the contrast. This is the same child after it had been deprived of its mother for 3 months. As you see, its expression is mask-like.
When I lived in New York 20 years ago, I was amused to find that there was a certain hierarchy, according to people working in the publishing industry, that it was assumed that all of the prominent people in the publishing house were in psychoanalysis, and part of your status came from when your psychoanalytic hour was. If you were a very important publisher, then your hour might be from 2 to 3 in the afternoon. But if you were farther down the hierarchy, then your psychoanalytic hour was going to be at the very beginning of the day or the very end of the day.
This room I call the ego. We are stepping now into my id.
You mean from the living room into the bedroom?
Yes, exactly.
And where's the superego?
And for me, it's been an endless battle and an expense and a terrible, terrible ordeal for the kids. And, you know, I'm just breaking even. I'm back where I was, you know, as a normal citizen.
Allen and Farrow were mobbed by scores of reporters and photographers.
Woody Allen's current personal life has been a parody of his movies. All of his children have been put in psychoanalysis. Even the animals, the dogs, have been in some form of therapy in his family. I think most Americans look at it and say, this guy's not real, is he? Well, Woody Allen actually in his real life is doing what he was doing in his movies.
On his way to the United States, Freud repeatedly said to his pupil Carl Jung, with some irony, "We are bringing them the plague."
The view that Freud was a great man comes directly from Freud. Freud is the only scientist of my acquaintance who took pains to tell us how great he was. He compared himself to Copernicus and Darwin. He regarded himself as one of the 3 great liberators of the human race from ignorance. He cultivated this myth assiduously. Freud occupies the place of a deity in whom people can invest their faith.
Every morning, I see him and I smile.
After dreaming Freudian dreams all night?
Yes.
Freud staked his claim to scientific immortality on what he called the Oedipus complex. He believed he'd made a momentous discovery, that all children want sex with their parents. Little boys lust after their mothers, little girls after their fathers, and sex between parents makes a kid jealous. If we're to grow into healthy adults, Freud argued, these childhood conflicts must be resolved.
When people object that infantile sexuality, Freud's infantile sexuality is a very arbitrary notion, they are told that you can observe it in any nursery. Right? And the reason they get away with this is because of the vagueness of the term infantile sexuality. What you have to do is to remember what Freud meant by it. What Freud said is, for example, that every male child desires to be penetrated by his father. This is the negative Oedipus complex. Not only does he desire to take his father's place with his mother, he desires to take his mother's place with his father. Freud attached enormous importance to this. He said it was the most profound and most difficult to get at of unconscious impulses. This impulse to be sodomized by your father. Do you observe that in every nursery?
Defenders of Freud always say Freud discovered the unconscious, but he didn't. Philosophers and even popular writers like Dickens had already used the concept. Freud claimed that dreams provide a window into the unconscious, which he called the id. During analysis, Freud would ask his patients to recount their dreams. Analytic interpretation of these revealed conflicts between the primitive sexual impulses of the id and the censoring, civilizing forces of the conscious mind, the ego. Freud made the incredible claim that his theories held true for all mankind at all times, but he only ever offered 5 complete case histories as evidence.
Repression. Freud had claimed to have absolutely cured his patients of hysteria. Those patients, from Freud's point of view, were walking time bombs, in the sense that insofar as Freud was to become famous for having cured them, each and every one of them could testify to the opposite. We know from his letters that not a single one of his patients had been cured.
In his American lectures, Freud described the first case of psychoanalysis, Anna O., a young hysteric whom he never actually met, but who was treated by his colleague, Dr. Joseph Breuer. Freud would continue to claim her case was a brilliant therapeutic success.
I think that there's no way not to describe the portrayal of that case as dishonest. At one point, about a year or two after Breuer had ceased treatment, Freud wrote in a letter that Breuer actually wished the patient would die to be released from her suffering. What kind of cure is that if the doctor would rather have the patient die than live? That's no cure at all.
Again and again, Freud tried to oblige his patients to remember things which they didn't remember, oblige them to confess to impulses which they still felt that they never harbored. And so his technique was that of a prosecuting attorney rather than that of a physician. Freud lied continually. Freud egregiously doctored the evidence, misreported it, fabricated enormous parts of these case histories. Once one is in possession of knowledge of that kind, one would have to have the faith of a follower of David Koresh to continue to believe that these case histories constitute scientific evidence.
But Freud's pioneer formulations have long since been reconfirmed again and again. Our understanding of obsessions of phobias, of conversion symptoms, have been tried and tested in the crucible of the psychoanalytic laboratory by many different analysts all over the world. And they've been able to rediscover the fundamentals of psychoanalysis as well as going on to make new contributions.
Freud called psychoanalysis the secret science. He and his followers have always prevented outsiders from putting it to the test. They simply demand we accept it on trust.
I would prefer to ask a more radical question, not does Freud overgeneralize, but are there Freudian phenomena? I mean, do they exist? Has anyone ever come to grief because of his repressed incestuous feelings for his mother? Now, for example, Freud has a theory that migraine headaches in virginal girls is due to the fact that they have unconscious fantasies of being penetrated by a male. And he calls these defloration fantasies, right? Now, he's discovered that there's a mechanism in the unconscious which displaces ideas upwards. So the girl has an unconscious idea of being penetrated by the male organ. That's going to hurt because she's a virgin. But she displaces it upwards and it becomes a migraine headache. Right? Now, I don't think that the right question to ask is, but is that true of all migraine headaches? I want evidence that it's true of any migraine headaches. What is this displacement upwards? How do we discover that it's the case? Does the girl herself tell us? Does she say after analysis, I see what I was doing now. I was displacing upwards a fantasy of, dehymenization or whatever it's called. So I think that we are really being too indulgent if we merely say that Freud overgeneralizes results. I want to say that there may have been no results to generalize.
Playwrights like Tennessee Williams and Eugene O'Neill created characters built on sound Freudian principles. And this influence didn't just stop with high culture. It spilled over into popular shows like The 7-Year Itch and Lady in the Dark, and on into mainstream Hollywood movies.
Look, it all starts long before you can even talk. It may have started when you were a few weeks old. You may have been hungry, and too often your mother wasn't there to feed you on time. Then, later, still long before the doll incident, you wanted very much for her to love you. It wasn't your fault, but you didn't get that love.
I just adore his asking for more, but my heart belongs to Daddy. Yes,
Analysis had such a grip on Marilyn, she couldn't finish a movie without her analyst being flown in. And she wasn't the only star in full-time therapy. Others included Marlon Brando, Shelley Winters, and Montgomery Clift, who actually played Freud in the John Huston film, Freud, The Secret Passion.
Before Sigmund Freud, man believed that what he said and did were the products of his conscious will alone. But the great psychologist demonstrated the existence of another part of our mind, which functions in darkest secrecy and can even rule our lives. This is the story of Freud's descent into a region almost as black as hell itself, man's unconscious, and how he let in the light.
I just want to emphasize how important it was for Freud to be able to see with a new kind of vision. Not only be able to see outwardly, but to gain insight into himself and to widen his self-knowledge and to look at his previously unconscious fantasies in a way that had never been achieved before was remarkable and I think a work of genius.
It fits into the classic hero myths that we see in folklore, and if you read Joseph Campbell's Hero with 1,000 Faces, there's a sort of classic myth of the hero's descent into the underworld and fending off all of the dangers and usually doing it alone and then coming back with some unwanted truth that the hero dumps on mankind, and of course mankind's not too happy to begin with, and it fits so beautifully, and it became in a sense a very a convenient political weapon in the construction of biography and the history of analysis.
Psychoanalysis is basically a religion. It has a prophet, it has a mother figure, it has a theory of creation, totem and taboo, it has certainly has confession. Confession is really the heart of the Freudian religion. It has a better world that we're all working for. After all, when everyone has been psychoanalyzed, nirvana will come. It has an inner circle of followers. You've got to remember that Freud anointed 5 of his inner circle, gave them a special ring. These were the disciples. It has the disciples that broke away, like Jung and Adler, the Judas figures. Everything that you can find in any traditional Western religion, psychoanalysis and Freudianism has. It is nothing more and nothing less than a Western religion.
From the beginning, in order that the patient under analysis may feel free of constraint, he is placed on a couch and urged to let his mind roam freely. For every slightest thought or random memory may offer some clue to the deeply rooted causes of his illness.
When we are little and get all caught up in violent, opposing feelings, we have to let off steam by crying. Here you are, caught between jealousy, hatred, and yearning. You couldn't kill your brother, though you wanted to. You couldn't take his place with your mother. Storms of rage and fear have been building up in you from that day to this.
It's funny. I feel a little better now.
I had an analyst who didn't talk for the whole day at times. Finally, I rose up at the end of the couch and said something about, I wish you'd speak. And, of course, he said, I will when I have something to talk about.
Well, standing here now, after all these years in analysis, has it really been worth it?
Completely. I don't think I'd be alive. There was a time in Chicago where I drank a lot, and when I got back to New York before I got into another analyst, I drank quite a bit. And the minute I got back into analysis, I gave up the drinking completely. But if I hadn't been in analysis, I don't think I would be standing here with you.
Freud insisted that prompt payment was an essential part of the cure. Today's rate in New York is around $125 for a 50-minute session. Maybe a high fee persuades patients to believe that analysis works.
There's no question that some people who go to Lourdes come back much better than they went, though we suspect that most of these conditions are hysterical conditions. But that tells us nothing about the role of the Virgin Mary. No doubt when they went to Lourdes, they prayed to the Virgin Mary. The Virgin Mary was in their thoughts all the time. But that doesn't show that it was the Virgin Mary who was efficacious.
What does happen with great frequency, however, is that the patient emerges a believer in psychoanalysis. This is what psychoanalysis regularly accomplishes. It turns the patient into a proponent of psychoanalysis itself. In that sense, I regard psychoanalysis as a regimen of thought reform, not very different from certain forms of political indoctrination that we've seen in our time.
I think there's a moral to this story. Freud and his followers made promises on which they could not deliver. As often as not, the patient is much worse off, and money is the least of it.
I think traditional Freudian psychoanalysis is essentially dead. I think it has come and gone, but the influence of Freud on American thought and culture is not dead.
Most of the things that we accept on trust. We accept because we trust the people who tell us that it's true. We don't have the energy, we don't have the time to independently investigate, the claims to which we commit ourselves. We trust certain people, and there was no reason, perhaps 40 or 50 years ago, to know what we now know, that Freud is simply not to be trusted.